Today we're going to talk about regional economic integration. Regional economic integration are simply agreements between countries, usually in a neighboring geographic region, where they agree to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers to the free flow of goods, services, or other factors of production. Right? When you think about REI, you need to think about the fact that it happens in a lot of different places around the world to a lot of different extents, right? And the easiest part of regional economic integration would be to have a free trade agreement. This is sort of the first step. Moving on beyond that, once you've agreed to free trade, you will probably start to harmonize your customs laws and regulations, things governing tariffs, duties, and how products are recognized and defined. So the idea of a customs union usually can come pretty quickly after a free trade deal. After this, you might start to look at the idea of a common market. And a common market would be where there is an absolutely free flow of the factors of production between member states, right? So you start with free trade, you start to harmonize your customs laws, and then you actually migrate into what would be called a common market. Going beyond that, the idea of a more full economic union would be having a common currency, harmonized tax rate, and the same monetary policy. So here, this is quite a big step. And here you might want to think about the European Union as a good example, where through the introduction of the euro across most of their member states, through the removal of borders across these different nations, and through having a more singular monetary policy across the trade bloc, they have really hedged into what was typically the national sovereign government's role and are kind of arbitrating this a little bit differently with more harmonized common economic union rules. The last and most final step in a regional economic integration would be a common form of government. This would be called a political union. You don't see too many of these. You might argue that the United States became an example of that as it evolved from a federation of different colonies into different stronger states into a republic now that has a very strong federal level of government. So be aware of these different levels of regional economic integration and how you might use them as a definition. It's probably a good time to talk a little bit about the motivations for regional economic integration. The benefits of free trade, the benefits of free investment and reduced barriers are pretty well defined. Countries recognize them, and pursuing some degree of regional economic integration can really help to boost and strengthen economies. Linking countries together is also a pretty good way to increase interdependency, which can decrease the chance for armed conflict. And that's obviously one of the big motivators behind the creation of the European Union. When you think about things that might limit regional economic integration, it really comes into national sovereignty. You know, multinational enterprises would love a frictionless world where they can conduct their business without any variance from geography to geography. So you've got them pushing hard for improved facets of regional economic integration. On the other hand, national sovereign governments want to maintain their sovereignty and their control, so they act as a bit of a counterweight to this phenomenon. Talking a little more broadly about benefits of regional economic integration, you know, North America, NAFTA, currently rebranded, but the idea that Canada, Mexico, and the United States have this free trade zone where they're decreasing regulations and they're harmonizing their sort of customs definitions and regulations as well. So you're really kind of talking about a customs union in this instance. And the benefits are obvious. I mean, trade used to be like $300 billion in the early 90s, and that grew to over $1 trillion by 2016. So the idea that you can really grow economies by linking them together is something that makes regional economic integration very, very attractive. You know, the European Union is the largest exporter in the world if you look at it as a single area. And the majority of their flows of investment and trade is kind of within that trade bloc. Not having currency problems, not having very large differences in regulations, this really helps the economy to turn over reasonably well. Something that makes REI a little tricky is that now that multinational enterprises are so well dispersed, it gets really hard to talk about companies in terms of nationality. When a company is manufacturing in Asia and South America and Europe and the United States, how do you really know that they're representing one true national interest? They're representing their own interests. And it makes things a bit complicated because if you think about the tension between Mexico and the United States, there was the concern of manufacturing job loss in the United States in the automotive industry. Mexico was a big gain of a lot of those jobs, and production went to Mexico to a large extent. But it went with American companies. So it gets very hard to then say, what is the real national interest of the United States when you have some communities on one end that might be feeling individual-based impacts, and you have multinational enterprises that have their home country as America that have a very strong interest in this phenomenon. So it makes it a little harder to talk about country A versus country B when you have the tentacles of the multinational enterprises very strongly entrenched in both. When we think about things that are happening with regional economic integration in the world today, this continues to go on. NAFTA evolved and is still in force. Since 1989, we've had this sort of customs union within North America. The European Union has been tested through a number of different challenges, whether it's Brexit or the Greek loan default, still doing very, very well. In 2019, we saw over the summer African Continental Free Trade Deal where you had about 53 countries for a $3 trillion economic area really try to get their act together and say that we can benefit from regional economic integration. And this is an interesting tie into some of our early theories in the course. When you think about Huntington and Friedman, the idea of the clash of civilizations or a flat world, both of them would probably point to what's happening with regional economic integration as bolstering their arguments. Huntington would say the regional nature of these agreements is reinforcing his idea of civilizations. Friedman would say that we're just seeing the skinny end of the wedge of this phenomenon, and it will continue to grow outside of the bounds of Huntington's civilizations. So again, it's hard to look at this phenomenon and know whether Huntington or Friedman is conclusively right. I think at this point, they're both going to claim victory looking at the current state of regional economic integration. I do want to take a few minutes to plug a couple of interesting areas that I believe are going to benefit from regional economic integration in the coming years. I'm really excited about South America. If you look at it as a whole, it's the world's 5th largest economy with a GDP approaching $4 trillion. It's got the world's 4th largest population, close to 400 million people. They're united by very strong cultural similarities, linguistic similarities. They have amazing natural resources with almost a third of the world's freshwater, fossil fuel supplies. They can be a really strong independent bloc. And over the years, there have been these fits and starts of the Andean community in the late 70s, trying to create some sort of economic union. You also had Mercosur on the east side of South America, sort of going from Venezuela around Brazil down to Argentina. These trade blocs have started to work a little better and also more cooperatively with the idea of UNASUR, the Union of the South American Nations back in the 2000s. This really emerged as an idea. So looking over the next 20 years, I would predict that regional economic integration will really find traction in South America and continue to help those economies grow. As also mentioned earlier, the expansion of AFTA, the African Free Trade Continental Deal, this is really exciting. A lot of African investment had been from former colonial nations coming in and enhancing trade routes with them. This is a huge step to Africa building their own strong, interlinked, interdependent economy that's going to help these countries flourish. It's going to drive infrastructure investments, which will in turn attract even more foreign direct investment. So keep your eye on those two areas of the world as regards regional economic integration in the future.